A smoky haze fills the cold air of the courtroom. The flicker of torches casts shifting shadows against the damp stone walls. The room smells of sweat, candle wax, and old wood. At the center of it all stands a young girl, barely 19, her wrists bound, her hair freshly shorn. A crowd of men in dark robes and mitres sit in judgment before her. Bishops, priests, and English officials, powerful men, watch her like vultures circling dying prey. The bishop leans forward. His voice is cold. "Do you deny hearing the voices?" Joan raises her head. Her voice is clear and steady. "I heard them. They were sent by God." The bishop's mouth tightens. "And do you persist in wearing male clothing?" Joan's gaze hardens. It was the will of God. A ripple of murmurs spreads through the courtroom. Outside the heavy wooden doors, the sound of a restless crowd grows louder. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. The flames are already prepared. But Joan does not tremble. Her mission is complete. This is the story of Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant girl who rose from the fields of rural France to lead armies into battle, crown a king, and defy the most powerful men in Europe, all before her 20th birthday. Hers is a story of faith, courage, betrayal, and martyrdom. But above all, it is a story of belief, the kind of belief that changes the course of history. Joan was born around January 6, 1412, in the small village of Domremy, in the Lorraine region of northeastern France. Life was simple and hard. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer and a local minor official, responsible for collecting taxes and organizing the village's defenses. Her mother, Isabelle Romet, was deeply religious and taught Joan to pray from an early age. Joan was the youngest of 5 children. Domremy lay on the border between the lands controlled by the French crown and those under English and Burgundian occupation. The 100 Years' War between France and England had already been raging for over 75 years. English forces had invaded France in 1415, defeating the French at the Battle of Agincourt. Charles VI, the King of France, was mentally unstable and unable to rule effectively. His son, Charles the Dauphin, had been disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which named Henry V of England as the rightful heir to the French throne. When Charles VI died in 1422, the French crown technically passed to Henry VI, a 9-month-old boy. The French throne was in chaos. Joan grew up in this fractured and hopeless political landscape. French villages along the border lived in constant fear of raids from English and Burgundian soldiers. Joan later described how she saw her village burned and attacked by raiding parties. As a child, she and her siblings would sometimes have to flee into the woods to hide when soldiers approached. Then, when Joan was around 13 years old, something extraordinary happened. She began to hear voices. At first, the voices were faint, soft whispers carried on the wind, but over time they grew stronger and clearer. Joan said that they came from St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, 3 saints who appeared to her in visions surrounded by brilliant light. They told her that she had been chosen by God to save France from the English. They commanded her to seek out the Dauphin Charles and help him reclaim his throne. Joan was terrified. She told no one at first, but the voices persisted. Over time, she became convinced that God had set her on a divine mission. In 1428, when she was 16, the voices gave her a direct order. She must go to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and speak to Robert de Baudricourt, the local military captain. Baudricourt would give her the means to reach the Dauphin. Joan's father tried to stop her. He even arranged a marriage for her, hoping it would tie her to the village. Joan refused. She stood before the local magistrate and declared that she would not marry. She had vowed herself to God. In early 1429, Joan traveled to Vaucouleurs. She wore men's clothing, not as an act of rebellion but for safety during travel. When she arrived, Baudricourt laughed at her, a teenage peasant girl claiming to be sent by God to lead the French army. But Joan didn't leave. She lingered in the town for weeks, attracting attention. Joan began to predict military outcomes. When she correctly foresaw a French defeat near Orléans, Baudricourt began to reconsider. Eventually, he agreed to send Joan to Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles held court. The journey to Chinon was dangerous. Joan and her small escort had to pass through enemy territory. They traveled by night to avoid detection. Joan cut her hair short and wore men's clothing to avoid unwanted attention. After 11 days of travel, they arrived at Chinon in March 1429. Charles was skeptical. He devised a test. He dressed as a courtier and stood among his nobles. Joan had never seen him before, but when she entered the hall, she walked straight up to him, knelt and said, "God sends me to you." Charles was stunned. Joan told him that God had sent her to lead his armies, lift the siege at Orléans, and see him crowned king at Reims Cathedral. He was intrigued but cautious. In the end, the theologians could find no fault in her testimony. They declared her a true and faithful Catholic. Joan was given a suit of armor and a white horse. She insisted on strict discipline among the troops. No swearing, no looting, no women in camp. She carried a white banner with the names Jesus and Mary. But on April 29, 1429, Joan arrived at the gates of Orléans. The city had been under siege for 7 months. Morale was low, supplies were dwindling. When Joan rode into the city dressed in white armor, the defenders rallied behind her. Over the next 9 days, Joan led a series of assaults on the English fortifications. Her tactics were bold, almost reckless. On May 7th, she was struck by an arrow in the shoulder. Most commanders would have retreated. Joan pulled the arrow out herself and led the next charge. By May 8th, the siege was broken. Joan's victories continued at Jargeau, Meung, and Patay. She led the French forces through a string of triumphs. Within months, the road to Reims lay open. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral. Joan stood beside him, her banner held high. Her mission was complete, but Joan's enemies were closing in. Joan's triumph at Reims was the pinnacle of her mission. She had fulfilled the command of her voices. Charles VII had been crowned King of France. Joan believed that her next task was to lead the French army to reclaim the capital. But now that Charles was crowned, the political landscape had changed, and not in Joan's favor. In the weeks following the coronation, Joan urged Charles to march on Paris immediately. The English were demoralized after Orléans and Patay, and the Burgundians were wavering in their alliance. If Charles pressed his advantage, Joan believed that Paris could be reclaimed swiftly, striking a fatal blow to English dominance in France. But Charles hesitated. The French court was divided. Many nobles resented Joan's influence and distrusted her rise from peasantry to prominence. Charles's chief advisor, Georges de la Trémoille, was especially hostile toward Joan. Trémoille was a shrewd politician. To him, Joan's militant faith and uncompromising approach were dangerous. Joan pressed Charles relentlessly. Finally, in August 1429, Charles relented. Joan was given command of an army and ordered to advance on Paris. Joan's authority was now undermined by political interference and poor strategic decisions from the French court. On September 8, 1429, Joan led an assault on Paris's heavily fortified walls. The defenders were well armed. Joan led the attack from the front, carrying her white banner. She was struck by a crossbow bolt in the leg but refused to leave the battlefield. She struggled to continue fighting even as blood poured from the wound. But reinforcements never came. Charles's commanders, under orders from Trémoille, refused to support the assault. Without additional men and supplies, the attack faltered. Joan was dragged from the field against her will. The French forces retreated. Paris remained in English hands. After the failure at Paris, Joan's position began to erode. Charles began to distance himself from her. The nobles at court whispered that Joan's divine mission had ended. Some even began to suggest that she had been mistaken, or worse, that her powers had come from darker forces. Joan remained convinced that God's work was not yet done. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1429, Joan continued to lead small campaigns to liberate towns and fortresses in the Loire Valley. Charles was more interested in securing peace through diplomacy than continuing to rely on Joan's military leadership. Joan, however, remained focused on total liberation through force. Her next mission would prove disastrous. In May 1430, Joan learned that the Burgundians were besieging the town of Compiègne. Without waiting for approval from the French court, Joan gathered a small force and rode to the town's defense. She arrived on May 23rd and immediately led a charge against the Burgundian lines. At first the attack succeeded. The Burgundians were driven back. But as night fell, Burgundian reinforcements arrived. The French forces were forced to retreat back into the town. In the chaos, Joan was pulled from her horse and surrounded. The Burgundian soldiers dragged her to the ground and seized her. Joan was now a prisoner. The Burgundians imprisoned Joan in a stronghold at Beaurevoir. She attempted to escape. At one point, she jumped from a 70-foot tower, landing hard on the ground below. Miraculously, she survived with only minor injuries. Joan claimed that her voices told her to remain steadfast. In November 1430, Joan was handed over to the English for a sum of 10,000 livres, roughly the cost of a war horse. The English knew that Joan was more than just a military leader. She had become a symbol of French resistance. By capturing her, they hoped to undermine French morale and discredit Charles VII's claim to the throne. Joan was transferred to Rouen, where the English prepared to put her on trial for heresy. From the outset, the trial was a political weapon disguised as a religious inquiry. The goal was not to uncover the truth. It was to condemn Joan as a heretic and a witch, and thereby weaken the legitimacy of Charles's coronation. Joan faced 70 charges, including heresy, sorcery, blasphemy, and cross-dressing. The accusation of wearing men's clothing was especially damning. According to church law, women were forbidden from wearing male attire. Joan explained that she wore men's clothing for protection while traveling and in battle, and that God had commanded her to do so. The trial lasted for months. Joan was interrogated repeatedly in an attempt to confuse and break her. Despite her lack of formal education, Joan's answers were remarkably consistent and theologically sound. When asked whether she was in a state of grace, Joan famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Even her interrogators were impressed. But Cauchon was determined to secure a conviction. In May 1431, after months of pressure and psychological torment, Joan finally broke. She signed a confession renouncing her voices. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. But days later, Joan recanted her confession. She insisted that her voices had been true and that her mission had been divinely inspired. Cauchon seized on this as evidence of relapse into heresy. On May 29, 1431, Joan was declared a heretic and sentenced to death. On the morning of May 30th, Joan was led to the marketplace in Rouen. She wore a simple white gown. Her hands were tied and her head was shaved. A large crowd had gathered to watch the execution. Joan was tied to a wooden stake, and the executioner lit the pyre beneath her feet. As the flames rose, Joan cried out, "Jesus, Jesus!" Witnesses reported that her body remained upright even as the fire consumed her. An English soldier reportedly said, "We have burned a saint." After her death, the English had her ashes scattered in the Seine River to prevent relics from being collected. But Joan's legacy could not be erased. 25 years later, in 1456, the Catholic Church reopened her case. Pope Calixtus III ordered a retrial. After reviewing the original trial transcripts and hearing testimony from surviving witnesses, the Church declared Joan's trial invalid. She was officially cleared of all charges. For centuries, Joan's story endured as a powerful symbol of faith and courage. In 1909, Pope Pius X declared Joan blessed. On May 16, 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized her as a saint, Joan of Arc. Joan's story is a paradox. She was a warrior who never wielded a sword, a peasant girl who shaped the fate of nations, a martyr whose death would ultimately elevate her to sainthood. Was she truly sent by God? Or was she simply the right person at the right time? Perhaps the real miracle isn't that Joan heard voices or led armies. The real miracle is that she convinced an entire nation to follow her. Joan died at 19. Her story lives on. That is the incredible story of Joan of Arc. Thanks for watching.